It's my birthday in a few days' time, and I'm reflecting back on a birthday 20 years ago when my desire was met in a very specific way that really showed me God cared about me, and it was an Ebenezer moment for me. So I was in Melbourne, Australia. This was the year 2000. We were heading back to Mozambique, where we were living at that point, and I decided what I really want at this point in my life. We just bought some land and we were just about to build a house in Mozambique. I thought what I want is I want a dog. But not just any old dog. I had a very specific dog in mind. I'd always admired Weimaraners. Now, if you know Weimaraners, they come from the Weimar part of Germany. They're a grey pointer, a hunting dog, very athletic. They're aristocratic looking dog, beautiful dogs. And this is what I'd set my heart upon. So we wandered into a pet shop in Melbourne, and I bought a leather dog lead and a collar, and I even found a hardback book on Weimaraners. So we bought it as a kind of a faith statement. And as I flicked through this book, there was this gorgeous picture of a little grey, fluffy puppy with a white streak down its chest, and I thought, oh, I'd love a dog just like that. So we flew into Zimbabwe a couple of days later, and I figured I'm never going to find a Weimaraner in Mozambique, so I'm far more likely to find one here in Zimbabwe. So I phoned around the vets. Most of them had never even heard of Weimaraners, let alone knew anybody with one. But finally, I came across a vet who said, yes, there was a Mr. Davis who had a Weimaraner pair. So I phoned Mr. Davis up, and he said his bitch, Sky, was potentially pregnant. He said she'd had several phantom pregnancies, but he thought she was pregnant. So I told him about my story. I was heading off to Mozambique the next day, and I would probably be out in 2 or 3 months. And if she had a litter, please would he keep one for me? So he agreed he would do that. The next day we headed off. It was an 800-kilometre trip to our home in Mozambique. And where we were living was 300 kilometres from the nearest city, the nearest shops and banks and phones, electricity. We really lived in a remote part of the Zambezi Delta. And for the next 7 or 8 weeks, we were there in Mozambique building our house, and didn't receive any letters in that time, didn't make any phone calls in or out, so I didn't know what was happening. But after 2 months, we'd finished the house. We'd built it with local materials. It was built with coconut palm wood and mud, and it had a thatched roof. It was a nice small house. We had an acre of land, and I'd put up a very basic fence around the land. And I figured, now I'm ready for a dog. So we headed out to Zimbabwe for a rest. Arrived at some friend's house in the city, and as I opened the gate, this tiny little grey bundle of fluff ran up to me and jumped on me as I walked in the gate, and I had my dog. So she'd been born a few weeks after we left Harare, and she was now 7 weeks old, and Mr. Davis had brought her around to our friend's house and left her there with them for us. So I've got this tiny little dog. She even had a white streak down her chest, exactly as I imagined. Lovely dog. So I had my dog. I decided I was going to call her Kayla. Now, I'd come across the fact that Caleb, which I love the name Caleb actually means faithful dog. So I was going to call my dog Caleb, but then she was a girl, so she became Kayla. And we stayed in Harare for a few days, and we then headed back to Mozambique. At that point, we didn't have a vehicle. It was a long trek. So I went to the vet, got the dog with her inoculations and things, and I got some sedatives. And I bought a small rectangular shaped wicker basket. I gave Kayla a sedative. I put her inside the basket, and we travelled by bus. It was about a 4-hour bus trip to the border. And then we got on a minibus, chapasse they were called, a little small tight minibus with about 15 people squeezed into the back. And I'm in the middle of a row of 4 people squeezed into the middle with Kayla on my lap in her wicker basket. And she'd been fast asleep for, at this point, 5-6 hours. And then suddenly I begin to feel this stirring, and she's beginning to shake around in the basket. And I thought, oh no, she's waking up. We're still at this point 2 hours from the city. And I'm thinking, oh no, she's waking up. What's going to happen now? And then, sure enough, I began to feel a wet, warm stickiness oozing between my legs. And poor dog, she had weed in the basket. And I'm sitting in the middle of a row of people on a plastic seat with this urine pooling underneath me. And I'm sitting there in my shorts. Oh, horrible feeling. Fortunately, we passed some friends' farm, maybe 15 minutes down the road, and we got out at that place and we overnighted with our friends. We then headed the next day on another bus, finally got up to our home, and we moved in. So I now had Kayla. She was my companion. We went everywhere together. She was a gorgeous dog. And the months went past and I was training her. She was a good dog. She came when I called her. She used to run. She was very athletic. We would cycle and run out into the sugarcane fields that surrounded our town. She would run beside us. And this was a novelty. There weren't many people who had dogs that were pets. People had guard dogs, but they didn't have pet dogs that followed them around, that came when you called them. So very quickly people were saying, Kayla speaks English. She knows, she hears, she understands, because she was coming when I called her. At first, before I had the dog, the kids would chase after us when they saw us walking down, and they would shout, Mzungu, Mzungu. And they would taunt us, but I wouldn't respond to the Mzungu cries. But then when they realised that Kayla did respond when they called her, they started calling out, Kayla, Kayla. But the way they said it was, Killa, Killa. So everywhere I went, I had these kids following me going, Killa, Killa. And often Kayla wasn't walking on the lead, and the kids would call her and she would race after them and chase these kids. And it was, some of it was hilarious. There would be a group of kids playing with a football and they would shout at Kayla and Kayla would hare into the middle of them and they would just starburst in all different directions. And some of these things were very comical, but people were amused by her. They were kind of, I think they found it endearing. They also found it very strange. We didn't have children at that point. And everybody naturally thought that Kayla was my baby because she went everywhere with me. As she grew up, she became a big dog. She had huge paws. She was growing into a large dog, much bigger than any of the local dogs around there. And she had a big appetite. In the middle of the afternoon, each afternoon, it was kind of like happy hour for Kayla. The local neighbours around us were beginning to cook. The men were coming back from the river with fish, and the women were cooking on open fires. And I realised after a while that Kayla was beginning to disappear at the same time in the afternoon, and I wondered where she'd gone. Now, as she grew older, she found it very easy to hurdle the fence that I'd put around the garden. And I realised one day that she was around 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. She was running away. She was jumping over the fence, and she was nosing around the neighbours' fires and finding food. And then one day, a woman came and knocked on the door and said, and this is all in Portuguese, said to me, Kayla, your dog, she's stolen my fish. And I realised that what she was doing is she was running away. She was finding an unguarded fire and nosing the lid off the saucepan and taking the food and running away. Naturally, I didn't want the neighbours to get angry. I didn't want them to turn against me. So I gave this woman some money for her fish. The funny thing was, over the coming weeks, more and more people started coming and knocking on the door and saying, Kayla's stolen our food. And I realised after a while that although some of these were undoubtedly true, some of them were just people who realised that this was an easy way to get some money out of the foreigners, was saying that Kayla had stolen their food. So Kayla was an unusual dog. Now, one of the interesting things about life in Mozambique was that we were making every effort to identify with the local people. We had chosen to live there. This was our sense of call. We were part of a young YWAM team. We were establishing a project there. We had principles that we were trying to live out. We had deliberately simplified our life. At that point, we didn't have a vehicle. We had no electricity. We had no running water. We were living in a small mud house with a thatched roof. We were choosing to identify so that we could try to build a relationship well with the local people. But Kayla set me apart. I was set apart anyway, I suppose. I was a foreigner. I spoke a different language. I was educated. I had money. So whatever I did, I realised I was different. And in a way, Kayla was good for me because in a humorous kind of way, she made me realise I never can fully identify. I can try, but I'm always going to be different. And Kayla really did make me different. This came to a head, I think, when she was about 9 months old. There was quite a lot of mutt dogs, little mongrels that roamed the neighbourhood. And Kayla, I realised, was going to be coming into heat soon. And the last thing I wanted was a bunch of these little dogs around our house all the time with Kayla in heat. So I figured I've got to get her out of here. I've got to get to the vet in Harare, an 800-kilometre trip, which is going to take at least 24 hours of travel, given the mud roads. I've got to get out, and I've got to get her spayed, and I've got to do it quickly. Now, at that point, we didn't have a vehicle. The 300-kilometre trip to the capital, not the capital of the province, Beira, that 300-kilometre trip could take 17 or 18 hours because of the poor nature of the roads. And I would have to travel on the back of a lorry with dozens of other people hitchhiking. And I figured, there's no way I can do that with this dog. Fortunately, there was a sugar factory in the town which had a 17-seater plane. And this plane would fly into the town twice or three times a week with supplies and would fly back out to Beira. And sometimes, if you were lucky, you could hitch a ride on the plane. So I went to the sugar factory and I put my name down on the waiting list for the next plane to get a flight out. 2 days later, the plane came in. Miranda and I went up to the plane. We took Kayla with us. I didn't know if we were going to get on the plane or not, so I hadn't yet given her a sedative. The pilot said we could go on the plane, so I gave her the sedative. And then he said he would need to put the dog in the hold. Now, it's a very small plane anyway, so I thought, if she goes in the hold, that's going to kill her. How can she possibly last in the hold? So I said, please, just let her come on. She'll be asleep. And he said, no. And then he eventually said, well, okay, if you put her in a box, in a secure box, you can bring her in. So I raced back to the house, which was about 1 kilometre away. I came back with the same wicker basket that I'd brought her up in. But by this point, she's much bigger. I put her in the wicker basket, which had a folding lid. But the moment I pushed the lid down on her head, even though she was, by this point, was very sleepy and kind of drugged up, she was scared by the dark. She was pushing the lid up. So there's no way I could hold her inside this basket. By this point, the plane is full of people, and they're waiting for me. And the pilot's wanting to leave, and he said, no, you'll have to go out on the lorry. And I said, oh, please, I've got another basket. Just wait for me, please. So he said, okay. I borrowed somebody's bicycle, and I raced back to the house. And I came back with one of those kind of Alibaba wicker baskets that was our laundry basket. And I put her inside the basket. Fortunately, she fitted. And I tied her collar onto the handle. And I then brought her inside the plane. He said, no, she can't sit in that. I'll put her in the toilet. So there was a tiny toilet cubicle in the back of the plane. So he puts Kayla inside the basket, into the toilet cubicle. He goes up to the front of the plane, and then you hear this thumping sound inside the toilet cubicle. And he balanced the basket on top of the toilet seat. Naturally, she's bouncing around. She's rolled off the toilet seat and is thumping inside this small toilet cubicle. By this point, it's embarrassing. I get her out of the toilet cubicle, bring her into the aisle, and fortunately, by this point, I think he's so fed up with me, he lets me sit with the dog in the aisle of this tiny plane, and I'm holding her and stroking her head, and he takes off. 40 minutes later, we land in Beira, and I carry on the trip the next day into Harare, and I get her spayed. And a week later, her stitches have all recovered, and we return overland with a 2-day journey back to our town where we're living. So the interesting thing, as I bring this story to a close, is that Kayla was undoubtedly a wonderful gift. She was actually my heart's desire. She was exactly what I wanted. She looked even exactly how I wanted her. She came probably the only Weimaraners in Zimbabwe at that time, had a pregnancy, had a litter, at exactly the right time that I could take a dog home. All of it was a kind of a unbelievable answer to actually unspoken prayers, just desires really. So she was an amazing gift. But the paradox of this dog was that she was also a challenge in a humorous way that made me realise no matter how much I try, I'm always going to be different. I'm always going to be an oddball. I'm always going to stand out. I can try to identify, but I will always be a foreigner. And so whilst Kayla was a wonderful gift, she was also very good for my humility.